What's up? What's up? What's up, beautiful people? Welcome back to another episode of the Grief Bully podcast. I am your host, J.Nicole. Today is Monday, November the 9th. We are back in the studio, rocking and rolling, episode 67. I'm super excited today, guys. As you know, over the last couple of weeks, I've been solo, me by myself in the studio. And for the entire month of November, as of right now, I have a guest every single week. What way better than to kick this off with this phenomenal guest? I'm excited, but before we get into that, let's just go over last week. I had episode 67, a solo round. It was short. I pretty much just talked about Kim Kardashian's 40th birthday gift. I usually don't talk about celebrities much, but I felt like I could really offer a different opinion on it versus criticizing someone in their grief and how someone tries to be there for them. Go back, check the episode out. It's on Apple, Spotify, all of that good stuff. Leave a review. Let me know what you're thinking. Before we get further into the episode, I definitely want to thank our sponsors, BetterHelp. They are an online counseling organization that's offering you therapy from the comfort of your home. Everyone's home and everyone's going through something. So definitely check them out at trybetterhelp, HELP.com/the grief bully. They do not take medical care. However, they do offer financial aid. And when you use my link, trybetterhelp.com/the grief bully, you will receive 10% off your first month. Again, trybetterhelp.com/the grief bully. Listen, we've got that out the way. We're back in the studio. As I mentioned, I have a phenomenal guest with me today. We're going to talk personally. We're going to talk professionally. He brings so much experience through life that I'm excited to share him with you and to get into this conversation. So today, all the way from Australia, we have with us the phenomenal Dr. David Roland. Dr. Roland, how are you today?
I'm great. And is it good morning, J.Nicole, or is it good afternoon?
You know what? It is actually good evening for me and good morning for you. So thank
It
you
is.
for being here in the morning with us. We truly appreciate that.
It's great to be on your show.
Thank you. So, as I talked a little bit in the intro, just about you living through your lived experiences, but also from a professional standpoint, I saw some of your talks. You've done quite a few of them. He's also an author, in addition to being a clinical psychologist. Few books. We'll talk more about his latest book a little bit more in the show. But I just want to get right into the conversation. I mean, we're in the world right now where everyone is suffering in one capacity or another when it comes to loss. So where would you like to start? You want to tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we can all just kind of learn from you, because I'm so excited to pick your brain.
Yeah, sure. You direct me where you want me to go because there's so much we could cover. But I think we do want to touch on, what's relevant for people today. And I can certainly spend some time doing that. But briefly, I've always wanted to be a psychologist from the time I was about 16, when I discovered there's this unconscious mind, and I started reading about that. And I went to university, became a psychologist, traveled the world for a while, after, leaving Australia, because the world seems really big when you're in Australia. And so I did that for a year and came back and still had my love for psychology. So my first job, and it's only because, it's the bottom of the rung in terms of getting entry into the profession, was working in a prison. So
Mm.
I worked in the prison system for a couple of years. And as you could imagine, anybody can imagine, for someone like me coming from a very middle class background, I saw a lot of things that I'd never seen before. And I got an empathy actually for people that end up in prison, and realize there's a whole story, a whole background to why people might end up in that situation. But some of those experiences I had in the prison system came back to haunt me 20 something years later. When I was working in private practice, I was seeing children and adults and doing forensic work for the criminal court and the children's court, as well as therapy. But I became traumatized, I worked out, from the years of hearing, traumatic experiences, people's stories. I worked with sexual assault victims, and I,
Mm.
met with rapists and pedophiles in the prison. So I'd seen the whole spectrum. And I think all those stories just caught up with me, and I started not wanting to go to work. I was getting nightmares. I had 3 young daughters at that point, and I was imagining them being in horrible situations, because I was visiting families where the children had been removed from the family because of neglect or abuse. So I could imagine my daughters in that situation. And I was traumatizing myself through my imagination, as well as, this bank of stories of 20 something years. And I went to see another more senior colleague, and he said, I think you've got post-traumatic stress disorder. I think you've become traumatized. So he said, your empathy has actually traumatized you because you've put yourself in the shoes of the others.
Wow.
You've experienced their distress, and it's had this build-up effect. And that made some sense. So I decided to take some time off my practice, thinking I'll get better in 6 months. But 6 months went by and I clearly wasn't better yet. And then the global financial crisis hit in 2008, 2009. And, I have so much empathy for people that are going through financial strife at the moment. I'm actually okay now financially, but back then we weren't. We lost all our life savings, and I couldn't work for quite a few years. And then I had a stroke out of the blue. So about 2 years after I stopped working. And that probably was stress induced from all the financial pressures. So then I had to get well again from the stroke. And that at that point, there wasn't a lot was offered for rehabilitation, particularly for my kind of stroke where I could still walk and talk. And my stroke really affected my vision and also the memory parts of the brain. So I was experiencing a lot of amnesia. So I set about developing my own rehab program, and that became the subject of my previous book, my memoir, How I Rescued My Brain, A Psychologist's Remarkable Recovery from Stroke and Trauma. And that informed me about how the brain works a lot. I learned a lot about how the brain works and techniques you can use to, get better brain health.
It's definitely, I would like to kind of go into that further. I mean, the
Yeah.
title itself, How I Rescued My Brain, I think there's so much there to be uncovered. So if you don't mind, let's just dive a little bit deeper into that part of it. So did you mean from the stroke and then how you got out of that part and then it furthered your practice or your research, or just give us some more information on that, if you will?
I think what happened, and I'm sure lots of listeners or viewers will relate to this, is that when you go through an intense crisis, you can feel like you've totally lost control. Like the world that seemed to make sense before now has become chaotic. And people who've suffered severe trauma, like I had, the world becomes really threatening. So everyday things that were fine before now, have this feeling of dread or threat about them. So when I talk about rescuing my brain, it was certainly rescuing my brain from a neurological point of view, trying to get my vision back and my memory back. But it was also just trying to get sense of control again. So I didn't feel like I was in this chaotic world. And, I can run through some of the techniques that I used. But the first thing really, and this is for any crisis, is to find the right people, to reach out and find the right people. And the right people may not be the obvious ones to begin with. What I discovered in my recovery journey was that, sure, some health professionals turned out to be the right people, but the first one or two that I maybe engaged, they weren't. They didn't quite understand me, or they just didn't have the right approach. And finding the right people is also finding other people that've been through a similar experience to yourself. So self-help groups are really, really wonderful. I found that there were some people that I would come across that I wouldn't have come across if I hadn't had my trauma and my stroke, but I could relate to them because they'd had a crisis. Maybe they'd had a stroke or a trauma or something completely different, but we understood what it was like to be in crisis and to be in distress and to experience, intense suffering. And they were sometimes the best people because you could just really open your heart to them. They would be authentic. You could be authentic. Finding the right people can take time, but I think everyone needs to do that. The second thing for me was obviously psychotherapy with the trauma stuff. The clinical psychologist that I went and saw turned out to be fantastic. And he stayed with me through the whole 5-6 years of what I would call my recovery period. And then the other thing I discovered was that from the neurological point of view, I had to retrain my brain in certain ways. And one of those was doing some computer-based brain training, because the particular injury I had, it knocked out a quarter of my vision, which has now naturally come back. But the difficult part was the auditory processing. So having a conversation like we're having now would have been impossible for me, because when you asked the first question, I would have been lost, partway through my answer, and would have totally forgotten what you said. And I wouldn't remember if I'd said something, I wouldn't remember what I'd said. So I had extreme amnesia. And not only that, any form of conversation or being around sound was incredibly tiring. So after a conversation, like even a brief one, I'd have to go and lie down and rest, which you can't you can't go through your life just having a little conversation, say, I need to lie down now before I continue on.
Yeah, I
So
think right now a lot of us probably feel like that just in overall what's going on in the world. Like just wait, hold that thought. I gotta go take a nap. I'll come back. But I get totally
yeah,
what you're saying.
yeah. And I want to acknowledge the cognitive emotional fatigue that many of us are experiencing at the moment.
Please do. I think that was one
It
of the big points that I really wanted to discuss with you is and which I'm sure we'll dive more into that here, is we're tired. We're tired, Dr. Roland. I mean, I feel the pandemic fatigue, just what's going on in society as far as injustices, the election, and just is so much, and then your personal life, and then your grief and your loss. And so it's like, how do we move through this? How do we grow through it? And so anything you can offer there would be excellent.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'd love to talk about that. And I want to acknowledge the grief, the fatigue, that sense of loss, and say, I'm experiencing all of that too. And I'm, if you like, an expert. So even the experts, and I have a professional network of lots of, experts that people listen to, all around the world, and they're all acknowledging this. So it's very real.
Mm.
And one of the things I've learned to do, J.Nicole, is read my body a lot better. Through the trauma and the recovery experience that I've had, I've realized I've got to rely more on my intuition and less on my head, and read my body. And one of the practices that I used to get well again was mindfulness meditation. And that particular that restructured a part of my brain which gave me better emotional control, particularly with the anxiety and the trauma feelings that I was getting. But one of the outcomes of mindfulness is that you do read your body a lot more, and I'm doing it all the time. So even as I'm speaking with you, I'm also vaguely aware of sensations that I'm experiencing. So when we read our body, then we sort of are more likely to take the action that we need to take. And one of the things we need to do a lot at the moment when they've got this mental tiredness is a lot of self-soothing practices. There's a physiological mechanism that's part of our brain and part of our body, which is known as the caregiving system. And that's particularly really heightened in mammals. So in an evolutionary sense, mammals came along, and we're the group of animals that are really caregivers. And as you go up the evolutionary tree, you get to primates like, the apes and monkeys, and then humans. And humans are the biggest caregivers on the planet, because our young are so dependent for a very, very long time. And this caregiving system has evolved so that we will take care of our young until they're independent. There's no other animal species that has young that are so dependent on their parents or their caregivers for so long. So what we can use this caregiving system by doing all the sorts of things that we would do if we were caring for a child or a friend or a loved one, and apply them to ourselves. So for me, that's things like definitely getting outside and being in nature. And I know that's not possible for everybody, in the current circumstances. But you can even do that, by watching nature shows. I don't know if you get David Attenborough and Planet Earth, but, fantastic nature documentaries. I often use my noise cancelling headphones and listen to nature sounds, like rain
Me too.
or flowing water. And so that can transport you into this different state of mind, and it's very self-soothing. So physiologically speaking, you're caring for yourself. The other thing we want to do, of course, is do what we're doing right now, J.Nicole, and people listening to us are doing right now is connection. Having your experiences validated by somebody else, being able to tell your story to somebody else who's interested and who cares and who's understanding, and then listening to their story as well. So when we share our stories, we're actually activating that caregiving system. That's part of the affiliative connecting system.
Hey, I never
And
looked at it that way, as far as, for one, about the mammals part of it and how we are the ultimate caregivers, and that our children need us and we need our parents for such a long time versus any other species. I never looked at it that way. So thank you for offering that perspective, for sure. And I also never looked at telling our story as much as caregiving, but now I'm connecting those dots from what you're saying. So it's definitely enlightening. As I always say, hey, tell your story. Your story has power, your story has healing, but I never looked at it as it's a caregiving tactic that can help you grow.
yeah. And, as I said before, finding the right people, we don't always find the right person to tell our story straight away. And when we're listening to somebody's story and their experience about loss or about distress, whatever it is, one of the attitudes we want to bring is non-judgmental attitude. So, you and I might both experience the same event, which is maybe we experience a natural disaster. One of us seems to get over that more quickly than the other one, or, one is more disturbed by it than the other one. So we've got to be careful that because I get over it or I move forward or I react to it in a certain way, that should be how you do that as well. So we've got to have this non-judgmental attitude where we don't tell the person what they should be thinking and feeling or even what they should be doing. So in a crisis situation, we want to keep people safe and provide for practical needs for sure. But other than that, we just want to listen in a non-judgmental kind of way. And I really like the term expert companion. It's a term devised by Richard Tedeschi, who's one of the founders of a research field called post-traumatic growth. And his idea is that, the person going through the experience is the true expert about their experience, but I'm the companion to them. And I will offer different perspectives sometimes or ask helpful questions like, how are you feeling about that? Or, how are you thinking about the future? It's just a way of helping you to tell your story. And when you tell your story, or when we tell our story, sometimes over and over and over again, it's our way of coming to grips with this new reality. I'm sure and your listeners know that with loss, if we lose a loved one, it's like we have to keep telling the story one way after, in one form or another, or experiencing life again and then again and again and say, well, that person's no longer there. I remember when we were shopping here before and she said, but she's no longer there. And this is our way of coming to grips with reality. It's like a grinding away of the old and transforming into the new.
I love that. I love that so much. I've never heard of that either. Expert companion. And of course, I understand that we do tell our story multiple times, but that's another part too that I'm often challenged with, is how are we to show support for other people? How do we help other folks in their suffering? Because more than likely, we're also going through some extent of suffering as well. So I think that could be helpful. And I'm sure there's other parts of it that I'm not looking at it from that vantage point that you can offer. How do you think we move through grief? How do we move through the loss? Is it as simple as just getting counseling and wanting to feel better?
No, I don't think it is. Um, let's take a bit of a dive into to psychologically what's happening uh, preceding a loss. So when we're born, obviously we have some genetic disposition. You know, part of our personality is just inherited through our parents, but a lot of it is cultivated also through our environmental experiences. But what we don't realize that we're doing as we're growing up is we're forming core beliefs about ourselves, the type of person we are, and also about how the way the world works, where the world is obviously, you know, important people in our life, our school environment, our neighborhood, you know, and the bigger picture. And so we create these core beliefs without even realizing it. It's like, you know, it's like we have awareness of everything, but we don't realize that we have awareness of things until we stop and think about it. So we cultivate these core beliefs, and when we have a loss, and when I'm talking about a loss, I'm talking about, you know, a major disruption to the plans of how you thought your life story was going to go. So we're always projecting ahead and imagining how our life story will go. And that's another amazing capability of the human species, is that we can time travel, we can do mental time travel. So we can go back into the past, we can ruminate on the past, or we can learn from the past. And we say, oh, you know, when I was in that situation before, I learned that I should do this rather than that. And so we project that into the present, and we can also create stories about the future, how we think the future is going to go. Now that's useful in terms of goal setting and planning ahead, but it's actually not useful when the plan doesn't work.
Mm.
And one of the things that I imagine that we're all realizing really acutely at the moment is that most of the things that happen in our life, certainly the big things, are outside of our control. We actually don't have as much control as our core beliefs tend to think we have. So when we have something, you know, like a world pandemic, which is out of everybody's individual control, or certainly out of my control,
Out of
um,
mine.
yours too, good, there's two of us, um, that that that's a major disruption to our sense of self, to these core beliefs. And one of the core beliefs we have is that the world makes sense. And if I behave in a good way, or in a proper way, or in accordance with what society suggests are the social norms, I should get good outcomes, or the expected outcomes. When that doesn't happen, like there's an injustice, or there's a natural disaster, or someone has a child who's stillborn, or somebody gets a life-threatening illness, but they've been they're a health nut, they do all the right things, and yet they get the illness, and their cousin or whoever doesn't get the illness, and they smoke and they do all the wrong things. This really challenges our sense of self. So what's happening is that the world starts to not make sense anymore like it did. So we've got to create a new set of beliefs that incorporates this new understanding of the way the world works, and I call that wisdom. You know, if I could use a metaphor, I was thinking about this metaphor this morning. Actually, I went for a swim early this morning, and you know, when you're driving a car on a dirty road and it's getting mutt and grit on the windscreen, but you can still see where you're going, but it's getting quite blurred. Um, when you clean the windscreen, put the wipers on, suddenly you get a view, you see more clearly that the outside is exactly the same, but you see the outside more clearly than you did before you put the wipers on or you cleaned the windscreen. So what's changed there is your understanding, or your clear seeing of what's outside. So I think what happens when we go through loss or major disruption or a life crisis, and we start to come through that, when we start to see the world differently, like that, you know, life is unfair. Some people get bad luck and others just get good luck through no fault of either party. That's wisdom. That's seeing that things that's changing our worldview to have a more clear worldview than it was before. And so the tiredness then is this having to make this adjustment to changing your core beliefs to these new core beliefs. It's really tiring.
Very tiring. Very tiring, but I love that analogy. I love the perspective that you offered there with it. And I never really thought about it that way either, that we operate on these core beliefs and how we perceive life is going to go. And that is unfortunate when you have a child that's born still and you have all of these things that I recently was at a pregnancy loss walk awareness, and they said it's important for us to educate our young people and people in general that every pregnancy doesn't have a happy ending. And even just that was something that I think we overlook because, like you said, our operating system and our core beliefs lead us to believe that, oh, I'm pregnant and I'm going to have a baby and we're going to have the baby shower and the room is going to be like this. And then you drive home and you don't have a child with you. And so how do we learn to accept those instances though, Dr. Roland? Like how do we process that? Even same thing with loss as far as your family members, say the holidays are coming up. So maybe last Thanksgiving you had your mom sitting there or your dad sitting there and this one you won't. So although we understand it's a reality, how can we tend to cope with that a little better?
I think, I might just tell you one of the stories that's in my new book, The Power of Suffering. And it's actually a stillbirth story. It's about a young mother, and she's having her first pregnancy, and she's, healthy, doing all the right things, doing all the proper things to prepare for the pregnancy. She goes for a scan. It's actually her husband's birthday. They go for the scan, and she's imagining it's going to be a happy moment for him and for her. And, they'll identify the sex of the child, and it turns out to be a boy, but the radiographer says, look, we've got some concerns. And it turns out that the fetus has 3 heart defects. And to cut a long story short, it's all in the book, but to cut a long story short, they have to make a decision about should they do certain operations or certain hospitalizations or have the child the birth induced and stillborn. And they actually decide to go to have the induced birth and have a stillbirth because it would save the child a lot of suffering. And even with the operations, if they were successful, which would be really, really invasive, he'd be on heaps and heaps of drugs for the rest, he would only survive for like a couple of years. And always be in hospital. So they decide that they would have the child, but he would be stillborn. No, she's imagined this first child, and they've set up the baby's room in the house. And, as you said, got this plan like you imagine it's supposed to go. They have the stillbirth, and she's very courageous through that. And she walks out of the hospital without a baby. And every time I think about this, it tears me up. But she goes home to her community, and she just for 3 months just stays home, and she takes some medications to help her to sleep. But at the end of the 3 months, her husband, and this is where the expert companion comes in, he says, do you think it's time for you to re-emerge into the community? He just offers that, like putting his hand out. Do you think it's time for you to And he'd gone around to all the shops in their community and told them, like she lost the child. So when she comes in, please don't say, how's the pregnancy going? She says that in that 3 months, her thinking changed, these core beliefs changed. So she came to the conclusion that she was a first-time mum, but she didn't have her baby with her. And when she arrived at that conclusion, and her husband said, do you think it's time to go out into the community again? She said, yes, I think it is. She had told her story to friends and obviously to him and to her parents over and over again. That's part of that acceptance period, getting to that state of acceptance. But by going back out into the community, she was physically going out to all these reminders where, like the shops and the places and the workplace where she'd been pregnant, but now she wasn't pregnant, but she didn't have the baby. And so that was reinforcing the reality that she'd lost the child, but that this was the growth aspect. She thought, well, I'm still a mother. I am a mother. I just don't have my baby with me. And so there we find the acceptance, the distress and the acceptance period, and then moving into the growth period, also with the help of the expert companion, which was her husband.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's just interesting that if we can just change some of our perspectives when we get there, because a lot of people, even myself maybe, or an ignorant person could say, oh, she's not a mother, like maybe you wouldn't offer her a card on Mother's Day or extend any sentiments there because she doesn't have a child. But it doesn't mean that she's not a mother because she did have a child. So I think that's huge. That's really impactful to hear that. Thank you for sharing that story with us. I definitely think that's important. So a little bit more about your book. Let's kind of dive into that before we wind up the episode. I would love to be able to talk to our audience about it and tell a little bit more. I know you're not a first-time author, but I know your most recent book, The Power of Suffering, Growing Through Crisis, it draws together real life stories of about 11 different people, I think, incredible people who have survived crisis and grew in transformative ways. So I would assume there would be more stories kind of like the one you shared and different parts of it. But why did you think it was important to share the stories of other people?
Yeah, I was motivated, first of all, from a personal point of view and then a professional point of view. And the personal was that after I'd been through all those difficulties I was talking about at the beginning of our conversation, and that period of time was about 5 years. After that, I started to notice that I changed as a person. Like I was feeling more compassionate. I actually was feeling much more grateful for the things that are in my life. My value system had changed a bit. Like I really highly valued the personal relationships I had, and I was putting more time and effort into cultivating personal relationships rather than taking them for granted. Probably less career focused, like, the career being number one. I was just more, being like a family man and thinking about ways of giving back. And I actually felt the most content and happy that I've ever felt. And I thought, well, how can this be? How can have I got through all of that? And I wouldn't choose to have it again for sure,
Right.
but I really like the results. So can I have the results? And what's going on here? And that's when I discovered this field of post-traumatic growth. That's actually a research field. And I went to a university symposium where a cancer researcher was talking about this with cancer survivors. And she listed the 5 main ways in which people can change. And I thought, wow, I've got all of those things. And so I thought, I want to see if this is a common phenomenon. And because I like writing in a narrative storytelling kind of way, where you take the reader into the story. I wanted to go out and find stories of real people and see had they grown and how had they got through their life crises. And I wanted to do a range of crises. So, the stillbirth one was just one of those stories. And I interviewed 3 experts, a psychotherapist, a psychologist, and a psychiatrist who also had their own stories. But I wanted to ask them, why do some people not grow? Why do they stay stuck in their suffering? Because certainly there are people that just don't seem to move through it. They seem to be stuck where it happened forevermore. So what's going on there? So that particular part of the book is more about that. And then finally, I thought, well, when people go through these life experiences, survive them and grow from them, they often have a lot of wisdom to offer. So what is it they would say about how to lead a good life? So the final chapter in the book is really just a short summary of the things that I learned from these people about how to lead a good life.
I think it sounds like a phenomenal book. And I personally myself want to get a copy. And I think for our listeners, I think one part of that in particular that a lot of people will definitely want to find more information about is why do some people stay stuck? I think because for myself, being in my position with the podcast, and I use my social media platforms as well as my everyday life to help people in these areas of grief and loss. But I do find, if I'm being honest, some people, it just doesn't, I don't want to say the word click, but you don't really see that progression. And I think it's a moment of being stuck. And I'm not equipped professionally to help them navigate that. This is why I always point them to professional help. But you do see some people who just thrive and they push through, like they have that moment of being down and out and really in a crisis part of their grief, but then they come out on the other side, like you said, in a transformative way, perhaps a better person in different areas.
Mm.
But then there's those people who it's like for years they're just in this place of not much progress.
Yes, and I think it's really worth emphasizing what you just said, J.Nicole, is that you'll come across people and you might potentially be in a helping role with them, like if they want the help, but they really don't want the help. And
Mm.
so there's a point where we just say, okay, you're doing your thing and that's what you want to do. I can't fix you, or actually we can't fix anybody, but we can't help guide people unless they really put their hand out. And that could be physically putting their hand out, or metaphorically putting their hand out.
Yeah.
And we can encourage them to go into certain environments, like go to a self-help group that might be appropriate, but we can't do much more than that.
That's very true. Very true and very simple. But what I love what you said too, and I hope that our listeners take that away today from listening to the episode, is that you can come out on the other side better and you can transform through all of your suffering and your loss and the crisis in your life. And I think sometimes, just as much as we have that core belief system for how we expect life to go, I think we can also adapt the mentality that we can get through it. I think sometimes it might be that simple that we don't believe that we can. And if we chose to believe it, then we would maybe put actions in place to head in that direction. Not as easy said, not as easy done as it is being said, but that's just my thought. But what do I know? You're the expert. I'm not. So
Well, we're all experts in our own life, and I can certainly say from my life, and also the stories that I researched, is that one of the growth areas that people commonly have is they develop a sense of courage. So when we're going through a stressful period, we're often just in survival mode, just putting one foot in front of the other, getting one day, getting through one day and then the next day. And in that time, you can't possibly foresee that there could be anything good that would come out of this or that you would grow. So we don't expect that to be happening for people at that point. But what we can really confidently say to somebody who's going through that period is that you will find the courage you didn't know existed, that you didn't know you had, just to survive. And if you can keep surviving, something will change. A person will come along, a new opportunity will open up, or you'll just have an experience for the first time, maybe a joyful experience, and that will be the start of the change. So
that's real good.
we can really confidently tell people that even if in the moment it feels like it's overwhelming and you're not sure whether you can get through to the next day, you can. But all you need to do is survive. In that early stage is just survive.
Just survive. I love it. I love that. That leads me into, I want to bounce into our In Love and Memory segment. It's a part of our show where it's very important for me to humanize, share love, and show love to our loved ones, our angels that have gone on. And whenever I have a guest, I like to share a little bit of love to them and to their family members. So I want to give our In Love and Memory segment this week to your parents, Margaret and Edward Roland. And just may they continue to rest well, and want to extend lots of love to yourself and your family. I don't care how many years ago it's been. I don't care if it's 20, 50, 10, or if it was yesterday. I think that when we all have to deal with loss and learn to cope with that, it's certainly important to make sure that those loved ones are never forgotten. So that is our In Love and Memory segment for today. Like I said, it's a part of our show that's very important to me. Our next part that I like to get into is our inspirational boost. We always have a quote or something thought provoking to add for the week, and that is sponsored by Adina J Designs. They make, create, and inspire us through decorated apparel, wood signs, custom tumblers, so many amazing things. Follow them on social media, both Instagram and Facebook, at Adina J Designs. ADENAJAYDESIGNS. Go reach out to them. It's getting to the holiday time. Get some gifts. Tell them I sent you. You might get a discount. I don't know. But closed mouths don't get fed. This week, our quote is, "It all begins and ends in your mind. What you give power to has power over you if you allow it." So that is our quote for this week. And I think it's an awesome quote. But yeah, so we wanted to definitely take care of that. Before I let you get out of here, Dr. Roland, I do want to ask you two more things. One of those would be, if you had to choose a color for your grief or suffering, what would it be and why?
Oh, thank you for this question. I would say that my mother's favorite color was yellow. So I always think of her as yellow, but she was English and she had very pale English skin. So her great regret in life was that she couldn't wear yellow very
Oh.
much.
Wow.
So, but I think of yellow for her. And then there's, for some reason, and I can't say why, but lilac is a color of grieving and care for me. So there's a story in my new book about a case of a young woman who was murdered, and in the book I go and visit her gravesite because that was one of the cases that really disturbed me when I was working in the prison system. And I took some, lilac colored flowers to her grave, and that just came from my heart. I don't know why I chose that color.
Wow, that is beautiful. That is beautiful. And it just shows how touching moments in our lives are, and that they show up in a whole different time of our lives, a different era, but they still have such an impact. That's the empathy in yourself and the impact that someone else's unfortunate story had on your life in a positive way. So what would you like to offer our audience before we get out of here? I'll definitely ask where they can find you, where they can get your book, but just a word of advice right now, where we are in the world with everything going on, something that we can just, a little nugget we can take with us and carry for the rest of the weekend and the rest of this year, especially.
Well, I would like to offer hope, that hope is actually a very real thing. And through all the stories that I uncovered and entered their people's lives, hope was always there. So even if you can't fasten onto a reason for hope, other than me saying this, and that you hear other people who say, I had hope that somehow my situation would improve, just keep cultivating that sense of hope that this isn't how it's always going to be. It's going to change. And invariably, things will change in ways we don't expect because we don't have control over our lives. So it's just having hope and then going with the flow.
Love it. Go with the flow. I like that so much. Where can we find you, connect with you, get a copy of your book, anything along those lines? I would love to share. And guys, I'm going to definitely add that into our show notes. So if you don't catch it all, don't worry. I'll make sure I reference it.
I think if you want to visit my website, which is David Roland, David and Roland, it's .com.au. You can find more information about me and the books and where you can find them. The audio book and the ebook are available everywhere internationally. The print book's just been released in the UK, but not in the US, but you can get it through Amazon UK or Book Depository, one of those.
Okay, that's awesome. That is all good stuff. You have been a phenomenal guest, Dr. Roland. I'm truly thankful and fortunate that you were able to come today and share your love, your light, your wisdom, and your experience with our audience. It's truly been a pleasure. I personally look forward to continue to connect with you, getting a copy of your book, and growing through my grief and my losses and my crisis. So I definitely thank you for that. Guys, it's been another episode of the Grief Bully Podcast. Episode 67 is now in the books. Guys, you can send me a text. Let me know what you thought about today's episode at 856-341-9950. I love to hear from you. Again, it's 856-341-9950. Check us out on YouTube. This episode and many others will be available there. youtube.com/J.Nicole the Grief Bully. And you already know, I say it every single week, I hang out the absolute most on Instagram. Follow me there at I_am_J.Nicole. Guys, till next time, you already know. Love and light. Peace.